Amen.
Go ahead and turn your Bibles this evening to Amos chapter 1. I was thinking as I studied this week, I started this series when this whole stay-at-home thing began, with the idea of looking at God in difficult situations and when it's hard to see Him. And in my mind, I was going to do this through the stay-at-home, which was only supposed to be 2 weeks, so it's going to be a really short series. This is message number 20 out of our really short series so far. So we'll see how long the Lord continues this series out. Amos chapter 1, starting in verse 1. If you find a place, you're able to stand this evening. I invite you to do so. Amos 1, starting in verse 1, says, "The words of Amos, he saw concerning the earthquake, and he will roar from Zion, and utter his voice from Jerusalem, and the habitations of the shepherds shall mourn, and the top of Carmel shall wither. And the top of Carmel shall wither. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they have threshed Gilead, fire into the house of Hazael, which shall devour the palaces of Ben-Hadad, and I will break also the bar of Damascus, and cut off the inhabitant from the plain of Avon, and him that holdeth the scepter from the house of Eden, and the people of Syria shall go into captivity unto Kir, saith the Lord. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4 I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they carried away captive the whole captivity, to deliver them up to Edom. But I will send a fire on the wall of Gaza, which shall devour the palaces thereof, and I will cut off the inhabitant from Ashdod, and him that holdeth the scepter from Ashkelon, and I will turn mine hand against Ekron, and the remnant of the Philistines shall perish, saith the Lord. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Tyrus, and for 4 I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they delivered up the whole captivity to Eden, and remembered not the brotherly covenant." We could keep going on from there, but I think we see a pattern here going on in this passage. We'll get more into this as we go. Let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. Lord, I want to pray that you will use me this evening. Lord, I pray that you will speak through me. You know that I don't want to get in the way of your word. I don't want my inabilities or shortcomings to hinder what you want us to hear this evening, Lord. I pray that you will use this time in your word, Lord, in your house. Praise in your name. Amen.
Amen.
You can go ahead and be seated. Again, as we go through the message now, we're going to look at a few different places in this book, but where we began, what we're seeing is the call of Amos. He is a shepherd minding his own business. God comes to him, and God comes to him for a specific reason. He has a job for him to do. The children of Israel, as we saw through there, have once again turned from God. Once again, they're not living how they ought to, and they're doing things that they know they shouldn't. And we're going to get more into this as we go, so I don't want to get ahead of myself in this, but for the moment, we'll just leave it there. They've, as we see so often in kind of their history, they've once again made a mess of things. And God comes with the message of, I want to send you to bring them back. Now, and I may be the only one who notices something like this, or who cares, or enjoy this about the series. I've enjoyed, as we look through this, seeing God in all sorts of situations where seeing God isn't easy. That's, to me, been the point of this series, and what I've tried to get us to see over and over, seeing how biblically there are parallels of situations where they couldn't see God in their situation. And we have so many parallels that you and I face that we can't see God. We'll get into that again more as we get into the message. But let's just start off, somewhat build a foundation for what we're going to see tonight. Much like Amos, who is called to go to preach to a sin-filled nation, we have the parallel of so are we. Pastor just kind of alluded to this a moment ago. I love the United States of America. By the next few statements, I mean nothing disparaging about our country. I want to make that clear. I love our country, and I do. I thank God all the time for allowing me to be born here and to live here. That being said, our country is filled with sin. It's filled with sin, and very obviously getting worse every day. You don't have to look far to see that very clearly, especially right now. It doesn't take much looking. A handful of years ago now, our president had made the statement that it was no longer a Christian nation, and so many Christians got really upset when the president did. But I don't think he was wrong. Our nation is so filled with sin that we've gone so far from God. You don't have to look far. Things that not very long ago were to be discussing even to men, now things that are accepted in many Christian circles. About that statement, things that not very long ago worldly people that. And now we're accepted in so many so-called Christian groups. For example, it wasn't that long ago that that things like homosexuality was shunned by the world. That the world would disown their family members who claimed it because it was a disgrace. Now, not only is it flaunted by our world, but there are some, using the term loosely, churches allowing them to pastor.
Right.
We see the sin has grown. It wasn't that many years ago now that you had dry counties where worldly people realized that the problems that alcohol caused and the problems that alcohol brought along with it, they wanted no part of that in their county and made it illegal in their county. And now some supposed churches are teaching their members how to make their own. Our world is filled with sin and getting worse all the time, which parallels to what we see in the book of Amos. But there's one more parallel that I want us to see to start off this evening that is very important, and it is this. Just like we can see the parallel that their world was filled with sin and so is ours, much like he was called to go, so are we. I know this isn't new. Every one of us here could probably quote the Great Commission. Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Ghost. The group tonight, we all know that. That's not news. But I think the problem is that though we know it, we don't often do it. We know that's what we ought to do, but we don't often do it. I'm not pointing the finger at any one individual, but as we start, ask yourself. There are people who you come in contact with every day that you should be a witness to. Are you? Are you? Because there's a big difference between knowing what I'm supposed to do and doing what I'm supposed to do. There's a whole lot of difference in that. One time, the plumbing company that I worked for at the time, they hired a guy who was fresh out of college with a degree in plumbing. And at the time, I didn't even know that existed. I was a plumber, but had no idea that there was such a thing as a college degree in plumbing. And he had knowledge of all sorts of things in the plumbing field. It was really neat because he could spout off all sorts of facts and numbers like crazy. My boss put him on the same crew that I was on, and he had gone to college for however many years to get his degree in plumbing, and at that point I had only been plumbing for 6 or 8 months, and though he could spout off all the answers, even at only 6 to 8 months, he couldn't do anything. He had all sorts of knowledge. He knew, he had just never done. And there are a whole lot of Christians that is their Christianity. They sit in church every service. They're faithful members. They know. They could quote verses. They know what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to talk, what they're supposed to say. They've just never done. And here's what I'm trying to kind of build for our groundwork to get this started this evening. Our world needs Christians who do. Our world, I'm not disparaging knowledge at all. We need to know. We need to be in our Bibles and to be able to quote it and know it. But then we need to take that knowledge and do something with it. The world needs us to be active Christians. They aren't going to get better on their own. They need Christians who will step up. And we, just like we see here with Amos, we've been called. We've been told to go. Will we? Now, seeing those parallels, that's kind of our see God through it all, even though it would be challenging. The first place that we can see God at the state of their nation. We read, I'll have us turn over to Amos chapter 5, verse 25. They were involved in idolatry. Starting in verse 25, have ye offered unto me sacrifices and offerings in the wilderness 40 years, O house of Israel? But ye have borne the tabernacle of your Molech and Cheam, your images, the star of your God, which ye made to yourselves. Therefore will I cause you to go into captivity beyond Damascus, saith the Lord, whose name is the God of hosts. Remember who this is. These are God's chosen people. This nation who God has loved and God has protected. This is the nation that God led out of Egypt and through the wilderness. This is who God has led to defeat nations around. And rather than them recognizing what he has done and being faithful to him, they've chosen to take the gods of the very people they've defeated. Rather than sticking with God who has led them through all this, they choose to follow the gods who have been defeated. And that alone to me is just a little bit confusing. Their false gods didn't help them from being defeated. These other nations' gods couldn't help them when you came in and take their land, and they would have seen that on full display when you walked in and defeated them. Your God did, and He's defended you from enemy attacks and has given you victory over other cities when you've attacked. Why would you choose their God, who, just to be blunt, let them down? Who couldn't defend them. That's what God is saying that they've done. They have defeated a city and taken the gods of that city to worship them. I mean, that doesn't make sense. We're gonna defeat this city and we're gonna go into their temple and steal their gods that couldn't help them and start worshiping them. I mean, it doesn't make sense. And because of it, their nation was now filled with idolatry. Rather than serving the true God, the one who had done so much for them, they chose to serve the false gods that could do nothing. They're involved in idolatry. They were involved in injustice. Chapter 6, verse 7. Therefore now shall they go captive with the first that go captive, and the banquet of them that stretch themselves shall be removed. The Lord has sworn by himself, saith the Lord, the God of hosts, I abhor the excellency of Jacob and hate his palaces. Therefore will I deliver up the city with all that is therein. And it shall come to pass, if there remain 10 men in one house, that they shall die. And a man's uncle shall take him up, and he that burneth him to bring out the bones of the house shall say unto him, that is by the sides of the house, is there yet any with thee? And he shall say, no. Then shall he say, hold thy tongue, for we may not make mention of the name of the Lord. For behold, the Lord commanded or commandeth, and he will smite the great house with breaches and the little house with clefts. The great house with breaches, little house with clefts. Here, I'm going to simplify that right now. It's injustice happening. What they were doing was they were overlooking major offenses by the people and then giving massive punishments to the small things, which is sin. What sin men do. It's what people without God do. They want to look at, or they want to overlook the major things, make light of those, downplay them, and then make an example of the smaller things. We see that in our country. I looked this up today to confirm that I was right. I remember hearing this when I was the last person executed in the state of California. Was January of 2006. The last before that, I don't remember, it was back like 20 years before that, but the last executed in the state of California was January of 2006, over 14 years ago. A 76-year-old man who was legally blind, diabetic, and had to use a killed a rat with a garden rake. That was his crime. It was deemed animal cruelty. Now, I love animals, but animals. And I think animals should be treated well. Again, not rats. They should die a slow and painful death. But regardless, it's an animal. And this man was put to death for killing an animal. Yet in the last 14 years, and again, I looked this up today, and it's hard to get exact numbers, but in the last 14 years, there have been over 30,000 murders of humans in California. Murders of humans in California. And not one of those murders executed. 14 years ago, a man was killed for, or was put to death for killing a rat. But murderers, so for 30,000 murders, have been let off. Injustice. Injustice, making light of a real problem and making an example out of a small thing. Same thing that we see in the book of Amos. Major crime overlooked and minor things having major penalties. That's the state of Israel here. They were involved in, and I just have it this way, inactive Christianity. We see that. I'm not going to have us keep turning back and forth, but chapter 5, we can see that if you're reading the last half of chapter 5, you know what, I'm going to just have us read a couple of them or it's going to mess me up. Chapter 5, verse 21, I despise your feast days, and I will not smell your solemn assemblies, though ye offer me burnt offerings and your meat offerings. I will not accept them, neither will I regard the peace offerings of your fat beasts. Take thou away from me the noise of thy song, for I will not hear the melody of thy viols, but let judgment run down as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. Now, how is that for comforting, peaceful words right there? You've got God saying, starting out, I hate and despise your feasts. I'm not going to smell your solemn assemblies. You read that and you think, man, that sounds harsh. They're having the feasts and assemblies. That would be their worship of God. So if this is their worship of God, how can it be God is saying, I hate it? Here's how. It was fake. It was fake. All throughout here, you see God talking about their idolatry and about their sin and about the way they were living. And yet, while they're living in the world and while they are sinful men, they're still having their worship so they can feel good about themselves. It was fake. It was all for show. It wasn't, they weren't really worshiping God. They didn't really trust him, as was obvious by their taking false gods. It was just an act because, well, they knew it's what they were supposed to do. They knew, it was tradition. It's not a matter of we believe this feast is for any purpose. It's just, well, we always have a feast right now. And, you think about that. You ask people now what Christmas is really about, for example. Most people have no idea it has to do with Jesus. It's just, we do this in December. That's what this was. We weren't really worshiping God. It was just for show. And while it sounds harsh, God hates fake Christianity.
Yes, right. Yes.
He hates fake Christianity. The Bible talks about he'd rather you be cold than hot. That lukewarm, he wants to spew you out. He'd rather you be cold and not pretend to be a Christian than it be fake. Where the children of Israel are sounds a lot like our country today. Our country is full of idolatry. People worshiping everything under the sun except for the one who made the sun. People worshiping everything from trees to athletes to actors to shoes to whatever else. They worship everything. Rather than trusting the God of their fathers, they trust the gods of this world. Our country is full of injustice. I gave the example of the man executed already, and we sample of the man executed already, and we see the injustice in our country on the news every day. I was talking to someone about it this afternoon. I think it was beginning of June, just decided it's not worth it to watch the news anymore because it just frustrates me more than it actually does any good. Because we see injustice every day. Police officers trying to do their job, and in the process, the criminal gets hurt, and somehow the officer is seen as a bad guy, and the criminal becomes a hero. It's injustice.
Yeah.
That's what that is, and our country is filled with it, especially right now with all of the riots and all of the things going on, all making a big deal and idolizing the one in the wrong, while making the one who is trying to protect look like a criminal. It's injustice. Our country is filled with fake Christianity, with people who claim that they're worshiping God and claim that they are doing what they're supposed to, but they aren't. It's a show. It's an act. But here's what's great. Though the nation of Israel was a mess, and they were, God was there through it all. He saw their condition, which means he was watching. It means he was paying attention. Even when God says, I hate and I despise what they're doing, it means he was watching what they were doing. He was paying attention, and then took a step further, and he sent a man. I'll say it this way: though they were in sin, and in idolatry, and in a mess, he still cared. Though they had turned from him and rejected him and were living their own way, he still cared. And the same is true in our case as well. Again, one of those parallels. I'm not by any means preaching that we've taken the place of Israel, simply that there are parallels, that our God still cares. And if we will go, he's still sending Christians. Though our nation is a mess, God is still there. We can see God in their sin-filled nation. Number two tonight, we can see God in the coming judgment. Now, I've said this before in this series. I'm sure I'll say it again throughout. This is an area, judgment is an area we don't like to see God. We prefer to think of God as loving and kind and forgiving. We prefer to think of God with all of those positive attributes, which God is. God is loving. God is kind. God is forgiving. We see examples of that all throughout the Bible. We see examples of that all throughout our lives. but God is also just. And with justice comes judgment. And God was in their judgment. Every sin that we read earlier, you can read pretty much the entire book. Every sin that is listed that God was rehearsing back to them, he also proclaimed a judgment. Look at chapter 5, verse 24. We'll skip around a couple places real quick. Chapter 5, verse 24. But let judgment run down as waters, and righteousness as a mighty stream. 5, verse 27. Therefore will I cause you to go into captivity beyond Damascus, saith the Lord, whose name is the God of hosts. 6, verse 14. But behold, I will raise up against you a nation, or a house of Israel, saith the Lord God of hosts, and they shall afflict you from the entering in of Hemath unto the river of the wilderness. And again, plenty of others sprinkled in throughout the verses of this book. And though we may not like to see God in judgment is necessary. It's judgment that gets us to see our faults. It's the example that we see over and over with the children of Israel. That they turn away from God and they're serving idols, serving false gods, and it takes judgment for them to realize they're wrong and turn back to Him. And the same is true of us. That judgment helps us to see where we did wrong. I'll give an example. I use my kids as examples all the time. They're good kids. I feel bad because every story I tell about my kids always seems like it's a bad one. But they're good kids. They really are. But they're kids. Kids get messed up sometimes. And as a parent, punishing a kid is teaching them where they went wrong. If I, as a parent, just went in and punished my kids and never explained why, never told them what they did wrong, never tried to teach them through it, just punished them and walked out, it would never do any good. Because they wouldn't learn anything. They'd just keep making the same mistake over and over because they wouldn't see where they went wrong. Punishment is necessary because it shows where we went wrong, where we went astray. But punishment is also necessary because it sets us back on the right path. Again, we see it with the children of Israel that they're serving false gods and they are away from God, and He sends an enemy to come to feed them and to take them into bondage. And what do we see happen over and over? God sends a man, they see their mistake, and they get set back in the right direction. With my kids, I don't go in and punish them and leave them to go right back into what they did before. If I do, the punishment isn't over. Because part of the job of punishment is to then set them back the right way, on the right track. We need punishment. We don't like it, but we need it. And though we may not like it, God is in our punishment because He is just, but because He loves us. He wants to see us back on the right path. I don't punish my kids because I like when, I don't punish my kids simply because I don't like when they do wrong. It's not a matter of, well, it annoys me when they're doing something they shouldn't. No, I punish my kids because I love them and want to see them do right. God's the same way. That the punishment that was coming isn't because, boy, they did wrong and I'm just looking for a reason to knock them back in line. It's because He loved them. We can see God in the book of Amos in their sin-filled nation. We can see God in the book of Amos in the coming judgment. And lastly, we can see God in the promise of salvation. Turn over to chapter 9, verse 11 through 15 with me. The last chapter, in fact, we're going to read right to the end of the book, starting in verse 11. And that day I will raise up the tabernacle of David that is fallen, and close up the breaches thereof. And I will raise up his ruins, and I will build it as in the day possess the remnant of Edom, and of all the heathen which are called by my name, saith the Lord, that doeth this. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes him that soweth seed, and the mountains shall drop sweet wine, and all the hills shall melt. I will bring again the captivity of my people of Israel, and they shall build the waste cities and inhabit them, and they shall plant vineyards and drink the wine thereof, and they shall also make gardens and eat the fruit of them. And I will plant them upon their land, and they shall no more be pulled up out of their land which I have given them, saith the Lord thy God. Now catch this with me. God hasn't even delivered the judgment yet, and he's pronouncing their salvation from him. They haven't even been punished yet, and God's already saying, but here's what I'm going to do when this is over. As he said a moment ago, his reason for judgment isn't that he's mad, wants to squish him. His reason for judgment is that back. So as he's pronouncing their coming punishment, he's also pronouncing their restoration. That future salvation. Two ways to look at that this evening. We can look at it in the light of our eternal salvation, because we know there's a promise of salvation. Romans 10:13, whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Here's what he's doing. He's telling the children of Israel he'll save them from the judgment that's coming because of their sin. Sound familiar? That's what was started or was first mentioned when Adam and Eve sinned, and that we see all throughout the Bible is God telling of our salvation before the judgment even comes. We can see God in the fact that though we are a sin-filled mess, he still offers salvation to us. But I also want to, for just a moment, look at it from one other side, and that is from, and I just have a word this way, the restoration side. God's telling them he's going to take them from the mess they've gotten themselves in, and from the division that they've put between them and himself, and he's going to restore them that right relationship. That they've taken themselves to this place, he's going to bring them back. And he wants to do that with us. He wants that relationship restored with us. And does our country ever need that? How often do we make a mess of things and put division between us and God, and yet God is there ready to restore? Sometimes that means we go through a time of punishment first. We're ready to restore, ready to put us back in that right relationship. And I believe we can clearly see throughout the book of Amos that God was there. He was there in their sin-filled nation. He saw and sent a man to preach to them. He was there in their coming judgment, not to smack them around, but to bring them back to him. And he was there in their promise of salvation and restoration, which is a blessing to know, because God is here in our sin-filled nation. He sees. He knows what's happening. We often see the mess that's going on, and we see the craziness that's our world right now, and it's really easy to see all that and think, when is God going to step in? Why is God not dealing with these problems? Why is he allowing? He sees. He knows what's happening. He's still in control. Beyond that, he's still calling us to go. God's here. God is here in even the coming judgment, not because he likes to beat us down, but because he loves us, and God is there in the promise of restoration in relationship to him and eternal salvation. So though it may feel sometimes as though we go through life in this world, just as the world is just getting worse and worse, and have that mindset of, where is God? Don't worry. He's still here. He's still here. He still cares. He's still sending men. He's still setting people on the right track. He's still saving. It really just comes down to this for the Christian here tonight. We just have to trust him and keep going. It seems as though things get worse and worse, that you have more and more with the mentality of we just need to hunker down and survive. We just need to, find a safe way to get through this. And I know there are examples. You can talk of Elijah and others who God hid and protected, but the vast majority of the time in the Bible, what you see is in a hard time, God sending, not God hiding.
Yeah.
We don't need, during this hard time, to think, man, I can't be a witness because who knows what people are going to do in this crazy world. We can't get this mentality of, boy, things are hard right now because our world is a sinful nation, so I just need to hide. No, our world needs our light more now than ever.
That's right.
We just have to trust and keep going. Let's pray. Lord, I pray that you will help us to be able to see this, Lord. To me,